A trader dumped a dying orc woman at the edge of a frontier town, told a nurse to feed her or bury her, and rode off without looking back. Mara Holt had heard those words before, in one form or another, more times than she cared to count. Sickness didn't care what color your skin was. Death didn't check whether you were orc or human before it came calling. But most folks in Thistledown acted like it did. And that was the thing that had worn her down to a nub over 15 years of doctoring in a town that didn't want to pay for it. She was 38 years old, though the lines on her face made her look closer to 50. Her hands were rough from lye soap and hot water and the thousand small tasks of keeping people alive. She had buried a husband 6 years back, dead of a fever she couldn't break. No matter how many nights she sat up with cold cloths and prayers, she didn't believe in anymore. She had buried 2 infants before that, her own, in the plot behind the house where she still kept a little fence of white-painted stakes, though the paint had long since gone gray. After that, she had stopped expecting much from the world. She got up in the morning, she tended, whoever needed tending, she went to bed alone. And she did it again, the next day. That was the whole of her life. And she had made her peace with it, or told herself she had, which was close enough most days. Her house sat at the edge of town, close enough to the road that people could find her in the night if they needed to, far enough that she didn't have to hear the noise of the tavern when the miners came in from their shifts. It was a small house, 1 room for doctoring, 1 room for living, a loft above for sleeping. She kept it clean, because dirt killed as surely as any blade, and she kept it quiet, because quiet was the only thing she had left that nobody could take from her. That was the world the trader rode into, on a gray afternoon, with rain threatening, when he pulled his cart to a stop outside her door and hauled the orc woman off the back of it like she was a sack of grain that had gone bad. The orc woman's name, Mara would learn later, was Kesh. But in that first moment, she was nothing but a shape on a horse blanket, green-gray skin, gone the color of old ash, a wound in her side that had been packed with dirty cloth and left to fester. Her breathing was shallow. Her eyes were open, but they weren't tracking anything. Not the sky, not the trader. Not Mara coming down her porch steps to see what the commotion was. The trader was a big man with a beard full of crumbs and a voice like a saw blade. He didn't get down from his seat, he just jerked his thumb at the woman on the ground and said his piece plain, found her on the ridge road. Some kind of raiding party left her for dead, or her own people did, hard to say which. She's been slowing me down 3 days now. I got goods need moving before the frost sets in, and I got no more use for a dying knife ear that can't lift her own weight. Feed her or bury her. Don't much matter to me which. Just don't make me look at it anymore. He said all that without once glancing down at the woman. He just called an it. Then he flicked his reins and was gone down the road, wheels rattling over the ruts, and that was the last Thistledown ever needed to see of him. Mara stood on her porch for a moment with her arms crossed, looking down at the woman in the mud. She had seen plenty of things left at her door over the years. Sick children nobody in town would touch because their fathers owed money. A trapper with frostbite, so bad he'd lost the feeling in both feet before anyone thought to bring him in. She had buried more patients than she liked to count, and she had long since stopped expecting gratitude for the ones she saved. But she had never had an orc left on her doorstep like a stray dog. And for a moment, the old tiredness in her bones told her to just let this one go. There was war in the tribal lands, on and off, for longer than anybody in this town had been alive. Orc, human, it didn't much matter what she believed about any of that. What mattered was a body bleeding out in the cold, and a decision that had to be made before the light went. She knelt down next to Kesh. Anyway, she always did. The orc's pulse was thin and fast under her fingers, the sign of a body trying to compensate for blood it didn't have anymore. Up close, Mara could see the wound wasn't just infected. It had been infected for days. The edges gone, an ugly color, the packing cloth crawling with something she didn't want to look at too closely. Whoever had first bandaged this wound had known enough to try, and not enough to do it right. There was a long moment where Mara knelt in the mud with her hand on a stranger's wrist, feeling that pulse tick away like a clock running down. And she thought about all the reasons this wasn't her problem. The town wouldn't thank her. The orc might die anyway, and then she'd have spent good medicine and good broth on someone who was never going to make it. Medicine and broth that could have gone to somebody more likely to live. She thought about the trader's voice, so casual about it, feed her or bury her, like those were the only two options that existed in the world, like there wasn't a third path that ran between them. Mara had spent her whole life being told, in one quiet way or another, who was worth the trouble of saving. She had decided a long time ago that she didn't put much stock in other people's math. She got her arms under Kesh's shoulders and called toward the house for her boy to bring the door plank they used for hauling the wounded, and that was that. His name was Tomlin, 9 years old, sharp-eyed and quiet in the way of children who have grown up around sick rooms and learned not to ask too many questions. At the wrong time, he was not her son by blood. He was the son of a woman who had died in Mara's care 3 winters back, coughing blood into a rag until there wasn't any blood left to cough, and Mara had simply kept him afterward because there wasn't anybody else who would, and because the house had felt too quiet with just her rattling around in it. Tomlin came out with the plank without being told twice, and together they got Kesh onto it and hauled her inside, up onto the cot in the front room where Mara treated whoever came through her door. He looked down at Kesh's face for a long moment, taking in the tusks, the ash-colored skin, the ridge of bone over her brow. "Set, is she going to die?" he asked, in the flat voice. Children use when they already suspect the answer and want it confirmed, rather than softened. Mara was already cutting away the old bandage with her shears, and she didn't look up. Everybody dies eventually. Questions whether it's tonight. That seemed to satisfy him well enough. He fetched water when she asked for it, held the lamp steady when the light started to fail, and didn't flinch at the smell, which was more than she could say for grown men she'd had in that same room. He had seen worse. They both had. The wound, once Mara got it properly cleaned, was uglier than she'd first thought, a puncture that had gone deep into the muscle of the side, likely a spear or a long knife. An infection had taken hold in the days since, with the kind of speed that meant somebody's life was about to be decided by very small margins. Mara worked through the evening by lamplight, packing the wound with clean linen soaked in vinegar and the bitter yellowroot tincture she kept for exactly this kind of trouble, murmuring instructions to Tomlin, as much to keep her own hands steady as anything else. Kesh didn't wake for any of it. That was probably a mercy. It was well past midnight when Mara finally sat back on her stool, wiped her hands on her apron, and allowed herself to admit that she had done everything she knew how to do. The rest was not up to her. The rest never was, no matter how much she liked to pretend otherwise with her tinctures and her clean linen and her steady hands. She sat there in the quiet, listening to the orc woman's breath rasp in and out, and she thought, not for the first time, that this was the cruelest part of her work. Not the blood, not the smell, the waiting. She dozed in the chair beside the cot, the way she always did on the bad nights, and when she woke at first light, Kesh's eyes were open and fixed on her. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. Kesh's voice, when it came, was a dry scrape, barely more than breath-shaped into words. Why? Mara didn't pretend not to understand the question. Because you were breathing when he dropped you here, and it wasn't my place to decide you should stop. Kesh's eyes drifted shut again, whether from exhaustion or something else Mara couldn't say, and she didn't wake again until well into the afternoon, when Mara spooned watered broth between her lips, a mouthful at a time, and Kesh swallowed it because the alternative was not swallowing it, and some animal part of her had apparently decided, without consulting the rest of her, that she wanted to live. The weeks that followed were not easy ones, though they were, in their own way, some of the fullest weeks Mara had known in a long time. Kesh's fever broke on the 4th day and came roaring back on the 6th, and Mara sat up 2 nights, running with cold claws and the bitter tincture, and a kind of grim refusal to let the woman slip away now, not after all that broth, not after all that trouble. She had buried enough people to know that the body sometimes decided things the mind hadn't caught up to yet, and she was not going to let this particular body make that decision without a fight. Kesh's suspicion of her, once she was well enough to be suspicious of anything, was plain as day. She watched Mara's hands whenever they came near her, tracking every motion, the way a creature does when it has learned that hands can hurt as easily as help. She flinched. Once. Badly. When Mara reached too quickly to adjust her pillow, and then looked furious at herself for flinching, and Mara had simply backed off, set the pillow down, and said nothing about it, because there was nothing useful to say. Trust, Mara had learned a long time ago, was not a thing you could argue somebody into. You could only behave the same way, day after day, until the behaving became a kind of evidence. So she behaved the same way. She brought the broth at the same hour every morning. She changed the dressing without flinching at the smell or the sight of the wound, and she didn't make a show of her own competence, didn't perform gentleness the way some healers did, as though kindness required an audience to be real. She simply did the work, the same unremarkable necessary work she'd have done for anyone on that cot, human or otherwise, and she let Kesh watch her do it for as long as it took for the watching to stop feeling like bracing for a blow. It took the better part of 2 weeks before Kesh spoke more than a handful of words at a time. It happened on an evening when the wind was up outside, rattling the shutters, and Tomlin was at the table doing his letters by lamplight, while Mara mixed a new poultice at the counter. Kesh, sitting up now, propped against the wall with a blanket over her knees, was watching the boy's hand move across his slate with something like curiosity. "He's not yours," Kesh said. "Not by blood." Mara didn't look up from her mortar and pestle. "No. His mother was a patient of mine. She didn't make it. There wasn't anybody else to take him, so I did." Kesh was quiet for a while after that, and Mara let the quiet sit, because she'd learned that too. That silence was sometimes the only room a person had to say the next thing. "I had a daughter," Kesh said finally, her voice still rough, still finding its shape after weeks of disuse. Mara set down the pestle. She didn't push. She had sat with enough grief in her life to know that it came out crooked, in its own time, and that trying to straighten it only made a person clamp their jaw shut and swallow it back down where it would fester, same as any wound left untreated. Kesh told it slow, in pieces, over that evening, and the ones that followed. A daughter, 6 years old, lost in the same raid that had put the spear in Kesh's side. A husband dead 2 winters before that, in a border skirmish that hadn't even had a name, just a date and a number of casualties nobody outside the clan had bothered to record. A clan that had, in the confusion after the raid, decided that a wounded widow, with no husband to euch for her and no children left to tie her to the group, was a burden they could not carry through the mountain passes before the snow came. They had left her by the road with what supplies they could spare, which was not much, and told her, not unkindly, but not kindly either, that the mountains were no place for the slow, and she would only slow them down. Mara thought of the trader's words, "Feed her or bury her," and understood, with a small, cold feeling in her chest, that Kesh had heard some version of that sentence twice, now, once from her own people, and once from a stranger who owed her nothing. She thought about how a person carried that, how you kept walking, kept breathing, after the 2 groups of people who might have called themselves yours had both, in their own way, decided you weren't worth the trouble. "I'm sorry," Mara said, because it was true, and because there wasn't anything more useful to offer. Kesh looked at her for a long moment, her dark eyes unreadable in the lamplight. "You don't have to be sorry. You didn't do it." "No," Mara agreed, "but I can still be sorry it happened to you." That seemed to land somewhere. Kesh looked away first, out toward the dark window, and didn't say anything else that night, but something in her shoulders had eased just slightly, the way a held breath finally lets go. Mara told her own story a few nights later, not because Kesh asked, but because it seemed only fair, a debt owed in kind. She talked about her husband, a quiet man who'd worked the mine before his lungs gave out on him, and the 2 babies she'd lost before he did, one after the other. Each time the same fever, each time her own medicine not enough to save what she loved most. "I got very good at keeping other people's children alive," Mara said, staring into the fire rather than at Kesh. "Just never my own. There's a cruelty in that I've never made peace with, if I'm honest." Kesh didn't offer platitudes, which Mara appreciated more than she could easily say. She simply said, "That is a hard thing to carry," and let it sit there between them, acknowledged and unfixed, which was, Mara thought, about the most honest response grief ever really deserved. By the 3rd week, Kesh was walking, slow and careful, one hand braced against the wall, but walking. By the fourth, she had started doing small things around the house without being asked, mending a torn hem, splitting kindling one-handed, while her other side still knitted itself back together, hauling water from the well, because she said flatly that lying in a bed all day made her feel like a corpse that hadn't gotten the news yet. Mara found she didn't mind the help. She found, in fact, that she had gotten used to another set of footsteps in the house, another voice at the table, and the quiet that had defined her life for 6 years had started to feel less like peace and more like the thing it actually was, which was absence. Tomlin, for his part, adjusted to Kesh's presence the way children adjust to most things, which was quickly and with a directness that put the adults around him to shame. He came in one afternoon from the yard where Kesh had been teaching him to sharpen a hatchet properly, an angle of blade against stone that Mara herself had never quite mastered, and he announced over supper, with no particular ceremony, that Kesh had told him orcs didn't have wolves in their culture the way humans did. They had something called warhounds instead, and did that mean Kesh could teach him to fight? Because the Hargrove boy kept saying orcs ate children, and he wanted to know for certain if that was true, so he could tell the Hargrove boy he was an idiot with confidence. Kesh, across the table, had gone very still, waiting to see how Mara would answer that. Mara had looked at the boy, at his open, expectant face, waiting for either confirmation or correction, and had simply said the Hargrove boy is an idiot, regardless of what orcs eat, and left it at that, which had made Tomlin laugh so hard he nearly choked on his stew, and had made something in Kesh's face unclench that Mara hadn't fully realized was clenched until it wasn't. That was, Mara thought later, lying awake in the loft, listening to the house settle the moment she understood that whatever this was becoming, it had already become something. Tomlin had not asked whether Kesh was safe to have around. He had simply decided she was, because she was there, because she was kind to him in small, unremarkable ways, because she'd shown him the correct angle to hold a hatchet and hadn't laughed when he got it wrong the first 6 times. Children's math, Mara thought, was often better than anyone gave it credit for. Word traveled in a town the size of Thistledown the way it always did, which was to say quickly and with considerable embellishment. By the 5th week, most everyone knew that the nurse was keeping an orc in her house, feeding her, letting her walk about the yard, letting her near the boy. Most of the talk stayed. Talk muttered over counters and across fences, the kind of thing that made Mara's jaw tight when she caught wind of it in the general store, but didn't rise to the level of anything she needed to answer for. It was Garrick Voss who decided talk wasn't enough. Garrick ran the largest freight operation through Thistledown, and with that came a certain standing in town that he was in the habit of mistaking for authority over more than just freight. He had also, Mara knew from patients who'd come through her door with bruises they didn't want to explain, a history with women that made her stomach turn, though nobody in town seemed inclined to say so where he could hear it. He came to her door on a cold morning near the start of the 6th week, 3 men behind him for the look of the thing. And he didn't bother knocking before he started talking. "There's been complaints," he said. "Folks don't like a monster living at the edge of town, don't like their children walking past this house on the way to the schoolhouse. You want to keep playing nurse to it, that's your business. But it needs to be gone from here by week's end, or the town council's going to have something to say about your license to practice in Thistledown at all." Mara stood in her own doorway with her arms crossed and did not invite him in. She was aware, distantly, of Kesh somewhere behind her in the house, gone very quiet, and of Tomlin at the table having stopped his letters entirely to listen. She could have argued the medicine of it. She could have explained infection and recovery time, and the plain fact that moving Kesh now, before the wound had fully closed, was as good as a death sentence. She could have appealed to Garrick's sense of decency, except that she had treated enough of the women he'd left marked to know with certainty that he didn't have one. Instead, she said, and her voice did not shake, which she was privately grateful for, "She is not an it. Her name is Kesh. She has been under my roof and under my care for 5 weeks, and she will remain under both for as long as I judge it necessary, and not one day less, regardless of what the council or you or anyone else in this town has to say about my license." Garrick's face went a mottled red. "You'd risk your whole living for a knife here. I've buried patients this town wouldn't spare a coin for, Mara said. "I've sat up nights with children whose fathers owed me money they never paid." "Yeah. Nobody questioned my license then. I expect that's because nobody minded who I was saving. So long as it wasn't somebody they decided didn't deserve it. Well, I don't put much stock in other people's arithmetic about who deserves saving. Never have." She held his eye the whole time she said it, and she did not raise her voice, because she had found over the years that a voice that didn't shake did more work than one that shouted. Behind Garrick, one of the three men, an older fellow named Petrus Cole, who ran the smithy and had lost a hand to a bad accident some years back, that Mara had stitched up herself in the middle of the night without asking for payment up front, shifted his weight and looked for the first time uncomfortable with the company he was keeping. "You've got a week," Garrick said, and turned on his heel, and his men followed, though Petrus, Mara noticed, was slower to go than the others, and looked back once toward the house with an expression she couldn't quite read. Mara closed the door and stood with her back against it for a long moment, breathing. When she turned around, Kesh was standing in the doorway to the front room, one hand braced against the frame, her face unreadable, and Tomlin at the table looking between the two of them with the particular stillness of a child who understands, without being told, that something important has just happened. "I can leave," Kesh said, "if it's trouble for you. I've been trouble for people before. I know the shape of it." Mara crossed the room and did not stop until she was close enough that Kesh had to look up slightly to meet her eyes. "You are not trouble," Mara said. "You are a person I have chosen to care for, and that is not a decision I'm interested in unmaking, because a man like Garrick Voss doesn't care for the company I keep. If he wants a fight about it, he can have one. I've buried enough people in this town to know exactly how little most of them are worth grieving over, and I intend to make very sure you are not one more name I have to carve into a fence post before my time here is done." Kesh didn't answer that right away. Her jaw worked and her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with fever, and finally she said, "Lo, you would do that. For me." "I already have," Mara said. "I did it the first night, when I knelt down in the mud instead of walking past you. Everything since has just been me finishing what I started. The week that followed was tense, in a way the previous 5 had not been." Mara went about her business as she always had, treating whoever came through her door, though fewer people came than usual. And she noticed the ones who did watched her, with a new wariness, as if her willingness to defend an orc had made her somehow suspect herself. She did not let it show that this stung. She had a lifetime of practice not letting things show. Well, Cass, for her part, grew restless in a way that had nothing to do with her wound, which had healed enough by now that she moved without much pain at all. She took to standing at the window in the evenings, watching the road, and Mara understood, without being told, that she was waiting for the confrontation to come to them, rather than let it catch them unprepared. It came on the 7th day, in the late afternoon, when Garrick Voss returned with 5 men this time instead of 3, and a wagon behind them that Mara understood immediately was meant to carry Kesh away, whether she was willing to go or not. Mara was in the yard when they arrived, hanging linens on the line, and she set down her basket and walked to meet them at the gate before they could reach the door. "Time's up," Garrick said. "Council's decided. The orc goes one way or the other. You can make this easy or hard, Mara Holt. But either way, it ends today." Mara looked past him at the wagon, at the men flanking it, and felt something in her go very cold and very still. The same stillness that came over her hands in the middle of a bad surgery, when panic was a luxury she could not afford. "There is no council decision that overrides a woman's right to heal in her own house," Mara said. "I've checked. I sent Tomlin to ask old Judge Farrow 2 days past, and he confirmed it plain. You don't have authority here, Garrett. You have a grudge and 5 men willing to carry it for you, and that is a very different thing from the law." Garrick's face darkened. "Then we'll settle it without the law." That was when Petrus Cole stepped out from behind the wagon, where he'd apparently been standing all along, and Mara realized with a small jolt that he had not come as one of Garrick's men at all. "I'll not be part of this," Petrus said, his voice carrying easily across the yard. This woman stitched my arm back together in the middle of the night for no coin, when I was fool enough to put my hand where it didn't belong at the forge. She's buried half this town's dead with her own hands and asked for nothing back but the dignity of doing it right. If she says the orc stays, then far as I'm concerned, the orc stays. And any man here wants to make that a fight is going to have to go through me to get to her door." Two of Garrick's other men exchanged a look, and Mara watched something shift in the yard, some balance of will that had a moment before seemed entirely in Garrick's favor. It was Kesh who ended it, though. Stepping out from the house at last, tall in the doorway, her wound healed enough, now that she stood without favoring her side, and there was something in the set of her shoulders, some old bearing that Mara had glimpsed before only in flashes, that made even Garrick's men go quiet. "I have killed men who came at me with less conviction than you're showing right now," Kesh said, her voice low and level. "I would rather not kill anyone in this yard today. This woman gave me broth when the whole world had already decided I was dead. I intend to spend what's left of my life making sure that decision was worth something to her. If you want to test whether I'm capable of defending that, you are welcome to try. But I promise you it will cost more than you're prepared to pay." Nobody moved for a long moment. The wind picked up, rattling the linens on the line, and Mara became aware of her own heartbeat, loud in her ears, and of Tomlin somewhere behind her in the doorway, and of the strange fact that she was not afraid. Not really. Not the way she perhaps should have been. Garrick looked around at his men and saw plainly that the conviction had gone out of the enterprise, that Petrus's defection had cracked something that could not easily be put back together, and after a long, ugly moment, he spat in the dirt, turned, and told his men to get the wagon out of his sight. He did not come back after that. Water reached Mara some weeks later that he had taken his freight business to the next town over, after several of his regular clients, Petrus among them, made it known they'd sooner deal with somebody who didn't need 5 men and a wagon to threaten a wounded woman recovering in her sickbed. Thistledown did not become, in the aftermath, a place without prejudice. Mara was not foolish enough to think one confrontation in a yard had undone years of suspicion baked into people by nothing more than habit and fear of what they didn't understand. But something had shifted, some line had been drawn and held, and in the holding of it, other lines had softened. Children stopped crossing the road to avoid the house at the edge of town. A few of the women who'd been cold as to Mara in the general store started nodding to her again, then speaking, then, eventually, one or two of them bringing baskets of vegetables to the door the way neighbors do, as if to say, without saying it outright, that they'd reconsidered. Kesh stayed. It was never a question that needed asking outright, not after the yard, not after the wagon rattled off with Garrick's men trailing behind it looking smaller than they had arriving. She simply stayed, and the staying became, over the following months, its own kind of quiet ceremony, though neither of them marked it with any particular words at the time. She built a proper smokehouse out behind the cottage that autumn, working alongside Mara in the evenings after the day's doctoring was done, and there was something in the labor of it, the measuring and the notching and the raising of the frame together, that felt like its own conversation, one that didn't need talking to be understood. Mara found she liked working with her hands beside somebody else's hands for the first time. In 6 years, she found she had missed it more than she'd let herself know. Winter came, and with it the sickness that always came with cold weather in a mining town, and Kesh worked alongside Mara through it, learning the tinctures, learning which herbs did what, learning to set a bone and stitch a wound with a steadiness that surprised even Mara, who had not expected to find in her patient such a natural aptitude for the work that had saved her own life. By the second winter, folks in Thistledown had started asking for Kesh by name when Mara wasn't available, which was its own quiet victory. The kind that didn't announce itself with any fanfare, but mattered more than most things that did. Tomlin grew up between the two of them, and if he remembered a time when there had only been one woman in that house instead of two, he gave no sign of missing it. He called Kesh by her name for the first year, and then, one ordinary morning at breakfast, with no particular occasion behind it, he called her something else instead, and Kesh had gone very still over her bowl of porridge, and Mara had watched her set down her spoon and press the back of her hand briefly to her mouth before she trusted herself to speak. And after that, the words simply became part of the ordinary furniture of the house, unremarked upon, exactly as it should have been. There came an evening, perhaps 2 years after that first gray afternoon, when a trader had dumped a dying woman in the mud outside her door, when Mara and Kesh sat together on the porch step in the last of the summer light, watching Tomlin, taller now, chase fireflies in the yard with a jar he was certain he could fill before dark. "I never asked you," Kesh said, "why that first night. Why you knelt down in the mud instead of just deciding I wasn't worth the broth." Mara considered the question for a while, turning it over the way she turned over most things, before she answered. "Because somebody had already decided that for you twice over," she said finally. "Your own people, and then that traitor. And I've spent my whole life watching this town decide who's worth saving and who isn't, based on nothing much sturdier than habit and fear. I got tired of it a long time ago. I figured the least I could do, the one thing that was actually mine to decide, was to not let somebody else's arithmetic be the last word on whether you got to keep breathing." Kesh was quiet for a while, watching Tomlin's jar light up faintly in the dusk. "That's a strange kind of stubbornness," she said eventually, but there was warmth in it. "Maybe," Mara said. "But it's mine. And it's gotten more people through hard nights than I can rightly count. I don't plan on giving it up now." Kesh reached over, without any particular ceremony, and took Mara's hand where it rested on the step between them, and Mara let her, and the two of them sat there in the fading light, not saying anything more, because there wasn't anything more that needed saying. The important parts of a life Mara had come to understand, somewhere in those 2 quiet years, were rarely the ones that announced themselves as important at the time. Nobody had told her, the night she knelt in the mud beside a dying stranger, that she was choosing her family. It had simply felt, in the moment, like the only decent thing left to do. But the small decisions, the broth spooned out one mouthful at a time, the dressing changed without flinching, the silence held instead of filled with empty comfort, those had turned out to be the foundation of everything that came after. Trust built slowly, she had learned, was the only kind that ever really held its weight, and a family chosen, one patient act of care at a time, was no less a family for having been built out of nothing more than one woman's refusal to accept that another person's life was somebody else's to throw away. If this story moved you, consider subscribing and following along for more, because there are a great many more stories like this one still waiting to be told.